Chapter 19. The Making of Men. Lass, we're here. I jerked and looked down at the pressure squeezing on my toes. My gaze cleared and focused as I registered Gimli standing on the ground, his rough hands reaching up to tug on my foot as he bayed for my attention. Turning slowly in the saddle, I realized we'd somehow made it to Helm's Deep, like driving home on autopilot. I'd somehow managed to ride along with the rest of Roram, all the while my mind shutting down in delicious numbness. Gimli's comforting my hand on my foot and his soft words brought me back to reality, to the awareness that we had arrived and highlighting who hadn't. I think I preferred numbness. Aragorn came closer, already dismounted and leading his horse. Come, Lane, I'll take your horse and you can get some rest. What will it matter? It wouldn't change anything. Okay, I softly replied, sliding from the saddle and feeling my legs nearly go jelly beneath me. Gimli's strong, calloused hands steadied me until I regained my balance. Come, lass, he said, still speaking in those soft, deep tones. We'll find you a quiet spot to rest. I shrugged. Okay. My body slowly and painfully shuffled along, following where Gimli's guiding hand at my back pointed me. The aches and pain that had disappeared from the adrenaline of battle had returned tenfold, made worse either from overexertion or perhaps from riding a horse for the first time in so many years. Or perhaps my body knew what my heart and soul did and had merely given up to. My mind was exhausted and couldn't keep the minds of the humans around me out. I felt them pressing all around me, weighing me down and surrounding me until I felt claustrophobic. Shut up! Everyone just shut up, I screamed, pressing my fingers to my aching temples. Gimli and the Roran near me looked at me in cautious and worried glances, but Gimli finally pressed harder on my back, pushing me silently along. I can't keep their thoughts out, I whispered to the dwarven escort. We'll find you somewhere quiet, lass. Okay, I whispered, still rubbing my temples. I heard Gimli speaking with several soldiers and servants as we passed, clearly asking them something, but I didn't bother trying to listen to the spoken words when I was still overwhelmed by strange thoughts. My eyes focused resolutely on my feet, watching each foot fall with detachment as Gimli steered me along, until Gimli was no longer pushing me along. I looked up to see we were standing in a small storage room, or perhaps it had meant to be a bedroom of sorts at one time. There was still a straw-stuffed mattress on a box foundation along one wall, but the rest of the room was filled with woven baskets filled with food stores and extra clothing and bedding. Why don't you lie down and rest, lass? Gimli kindly advised, once again steering me to the bed. Okay, I again told him, feeling like the embedment of inertia, everyone wanting me to keep moving, to go forward, and if they pushed or pulled me along, I'd go. But when they'd stop, my body returned to rest, the state it wanted to be in. If I wasn't moving forward, I wouldn't have to face the eventualities. Everything could just stand still. Gimli pushed me back towards the bed, my pliable body sank downwards towards the mattress. But before I was seated, something caught and jerked my body to a stop. I blindly reached down, trying to brush away whatever was stopping me from sitting as Gimli wanted, but it wouldn't budge. I looked down to investigate what was poking at my side. I can't get this stupid thing. I trailed off as I struggled with the culprit. My sword wedged against the box supporting the mattress and jamming into my ribs as I tried to lower myself. I yanked at the sword, trying to free it so I could sit. I can't do this, I said, my voice quailing as I stood. Helplessness suddenly washed over me. I stood and covered my face with trembling hands, startled to find the skin they met were slick with tears. My body suddenly shuddered with the sobs I tried to restrain. Yet my grief was stronger, and soon I felt the trembling of my body as I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to contain the sight of my weakness. Lass, it'll be all right, Gimli shushed. I felt his arms about me as he unbuckled my sword belt and pushed me gently backwards. I fell gracefully against the bed, my hand still covering my shameful reaction as I lost control. My arms were tugged away from my face, one at a time, as I felt Gimli remove my bow and quiver. But as soon as he released each hand, I yanked them back to hide myself. to shut away the pain and grief, to hide from the world. Several moments passed as I silently pleaded Gimli would leave and take his pitying sympathy with him. I just needed time alone to force my emotions away, time to rebuild my hardened shell. But as great shudders continued to silently rack me, I suddenly felt the bed depress as Gimli sat beside me, wrapping his arms around my torso. I tried to jerk away, but the powerful arms of the dwarf would not yield. Clenching down like iron bands to hold me in place, quietly shushing me and speaking in his native tongue. The words seemed harsh and stilted, yet somehow fit the deep baritone of his voice. Only one other being in this world, or mine, had ever seen me go to pieces like this. Only one other being had held me as my emotions tore down my barriers, and that one being was gone. Yet here I was, safely ensconced in the comforting grip of Gimli's arms. My tears fell, and he only held me tighter as the floodgates opened. My body and limbs melted, sinking further into myself as I curled inward and wrapped my arms around Gimli's torso. My body tilted from side to side as the dwarfs rocked my heaving, shuddering body. His well-meaning comfort only served to fan the flame, my grief burning hotter and my tears falling faster. No one had ever held and comforted me in this way. No one had ever granted me the kindness and congenial fatherly comfort I was now soaking into my soul. No one had rocked me in the arms and hummed comforting tunes. No one had held me in the arms with the silent promise to chase away the nightmare and ghosts. And I revealed and despised that comforting embrace in turns. I delighted in his unexpected affection, but I loathed its sudden need. I may not understand what was between you and the elf lass, but I do know the lad cared a great deal for you. He would have wanted nothing more than to know you were safe and well. He would be glad to know you are here safe. He would have been happy to give what he could to see you here safely, Gimli whispered, his words rumbling under my ear. I closed my eyes, unable to speak, and my breath coming out in shallow gasps. My knees slid up to my chest as Gimli continued rocking me. Soon my breathing evened out as I lost even the energy to cry, and delicious numbness and darkness found me once again. My body was stiff when I opened my eyes again. I wiped out the crusted tears coating my lashes and pushed back the blanket that was tossed loosely over me. I was alone, and the room was mercifully quiet. Then I stood and redonned the weapons Gimli had left on the floor nearby. Legolas' empty quiver was also there, and on impulse I slung it over my shoulder as well. Sometime during my nap, cold resolve had found me again. I couldn't stay here and let myself continue to wallow in grief. There would be a time for feelings and emotion later. Now wasn't the time. Now was the time for battle, for war. I understood fighting. I was familiar with it. I wasn't familiar with feelings and emotions. Leaving my quiet sanctuary, I walked out into the hustling mass of the Rorik people. Eventually, I would have to find Aragorn or Gimli to know where I should station myself. But for now, I climbed the stone staircase to battlements. Standing high above the people of Rohan behind me, I gazed across the land. Darkness was falling, making the landscape hard to distinguish. So instead, I turned around and watched the Rohirrim as they prepared. Soldiers scurried about, trying to ensure the stronghold of Helm's Deep would be ready when the enemy came. Men hugged their wives goodbye as they escorted them into the caves, and mothers wept at the sight of mere boys being led to the armory. I struggled to breathe at the last sight. I had been a soldier. I knew what it was to fight and die for your country. But these boys were children. They would still have been playing war and not going to die in one. They have hope for their people, for their families, and though young, they are taught and prepared for battle, Aragorn said, walking to stand beside me. I was startled until I realized I must have spoken my last thoughts. I glanced again at him and then turned back to watch the boys being led away. I remembered the elflings I had played with in Lothrin, and tried to imagine them being geared and sent off to war like these boys. It just seems wrong for boys to go to war. If they survive, they'll never be boys again. It's like robbing them of their childhood, I told him, I shook my head. Never mind. I know it's necessary, but that doesn't stop it from being heartbreaking. I've seen soldiers die, but those were men. Men who'd volunteer to fight for their country. These are kids fighting because they have no choice. Given the choice, these boys will fight to protect their families and homes, Aragorn gently reminded. We lapsed into silence. You should be resting, Aragorn commented. I'm fine. You have suffered a loss, he repeated. He softly responded. It is understandable if you are not all right. I'm fine, I repeated. We have more important things to worry about. I expected him to argue or to tell me I was supposed to grieve. Instead, he placed his hand on my shoulder and squeezed. You are a strong, honorable woman and a fine soldier. I covered his hand in return and squeezed. We heard a commotion and turned towards the gate. They opened as a lone rider came through. Is that? Aragorn trailed off as his hand fell away from my soldier. He turned and stared down the staircase. Legolas, I whispered. My feet stayed rooted in place as I passively watched Gimli and then Aragorn fondly embrace the elf after he had slipped from Eor's back. He spoke quietly to them, and then Aragorn turned and pointed to where I still stood. I watched as Legolas quickly mounted the steps, coming towards me. My body was still immobile as he stopped in front of me and then pulled me into a tight embrace. He whispered words in Sindarin and then said in Western, Elena, I am relieved you are well. All I could think of these past hours was making certain you were here and safe. I pushed away from him. I have your quiver, I informed him, and then broke into peals of inappropriate laughter at my Serb declaration. He smiled and cupped my cheek. Indeed you do, he laughed. My hand swiped at the tears running down my face, and then I cautiously laid a hand on his chest. Are you really here? Are you really alive? He covered my hand with his, and I felt the beating of his heart under my palm. I am well, he kindly told me. I'm not crazy again? I asked, hardly daring to hope. It had made more sense before to believe I wasn't crazy. After all, my mind didn't usually choose to make up the horrible things. In my hole, in that prison, I had believed that I wasn't alone, or that I escaped when I hadn't. My mind didn't make up bad things to believe. It usually fabricated the things too good to be true. But now, him being here and alive was the kind of thing my mind would make up when it wasn't true. I am truly here, he replied. My hands carefully moved over his chest, examining the dirt and creases in his clothes. What happened? What happened to you? He sighed and looked away. I tried to place the look. Was it embarrassment? What? I pressed. I fear I was not as focused on the battle as I should have been, he admitted, still not meeting my eyes. I tugged on his shirt. What do you mean? He finally met my gaze. I was knocked from my horse by a passing warg rider and fell over the embankment into the river. It was swift and swept me downriver some miles before I was able to swim from the water and begin my journey back. Fortune graced me when I found Eorl waiting for me to carry me here more quickly. Yeah, but how'd you get knocked from your horse? I asked in amazement. He glanced away again, but then steadfastly met my eyes. I was concerned about you, and fear I was watching you instead of focusing on the battle around me. Legolas, I sighed. I can fight. You don't need to watch over me. It isn't safe. Shit like this happens, I said, gesturing to him. Yes, you can fight. You fight very well. It was truly enjoyable to watch, he answered, smiling in apparition. Your swordsmanship is yet crude, he laughed, but it was beautiful to watch you move, even seated upon a horse. I laughed along with him. Excuse me, we didn't use swords in my world. I've only been using one for a few months, I said, still laughing. God, I suddenly choked, my laughter stopping dead and my breath catching until I hardly felt I could breathe. You're really here. You're alive. You're real. You're here. I said haltingly, tears blurring my vision. He pulled me into his arms, and I clutched him tightly in my own. He didn't speak, didn't offer any useless words that would do nothing to change what had already happened. When my breathing had finally calmed, I sighed in contentment. Thank you for not dying. He chuckled at me, likely laughing at the absurdity of my gratitude. I love you, I whispered. I do. He stiffened in my arms. You do not have to say this when your emotions are so chaotic, he whispered to the top of my head. I took a deep breath and pulled back to look at him. I don't do emotions and feelings well. I act and try not to dwell on it. But when I thought you died, all I wanted was for you to be back so I could tell you that I loved you. So I'm telling you. No, thinking about it. I'm just telling you. He searched my eyes, and I held his gaze resolutely, letting him see me sincerely. Letting him see my sincerity. No. What? What do you mean, no? I repeated incredulously. I shall wait. This is not how I wish for you to say those words. I will wait for you to say them when they come from your heart, when you truly mean them, he insisted. But I do mean them, I maintained. I want more, he whispered. I waited, not knowing what else I could say, but somehow I understand wanting more. You don't want to settle, I whispered. I don't know if I have more to give right now, but I don't know if I'm ready. I know you're not ready yet. This has happened quickly for you, and I know you are not ready. I can wait. It shall mean more to me when those words are heartfelt. His head lowered until his forehead pressed to mine, our eyes closing at the shared contact. I shall not likely be able to convince you to go with the other women and children to the caves safely, shall I? I opened my eyes. You're the one that almost died here. Maybe you should go to the caves where you're safe, I argued. His own eyes opened slowly, laughter tinkling in their blue depths. I thought not. A throat cleared nearby. Legolas and I broke apart to see Aragorn and Gimli had come closer. What news have you of the ground you covered on your journey here? Aragorn asked, throwing an apologetic look my way. Armies of Isengard are descending on this stronghold. I fear they shall be here long. Legolas replied, even as a rumble of shouts sounded in the distance. We should inform the king, Aragorn said, again in that apologetic way of his. I smiled faintly. It's okay. War never waits. I turned to Legolas and pulled his empty quiver over my head. Here. It's empty, but you can probably find more arrows somewhere, I told him. You guys go talk with the king. I started to turn away, but Legolas grabbed my forearm. You shall not accompany us? No, I answered, shaking my head. I'll go find my own place on the parpets. He looked startled, so I continued. We can't fight beside each other. We'll be too worried about one another. This'll be safer. His jaw clenched, but then he nodded. I stepped closer. The military in my country didn't allow family or even people from the same areas or hometowns to serve in the same companies. It was so if a unit got into a bad situation in battle, a city or family wouldn't lose all their young men. I knew that, but I never really understood or agreed with it. I thought if families and old friends were allowed to fight alongside each other, they would fight better, trying to protect each other and pushing each other. They'd have each other to fight for, but I get it now. It's too distracting. I'm terrified of letting you out of my sight, but it would be worse if we were constantly looking over our shoulders for each other. And perhaps if I wasn't there, I wouldn't alter the outcome of the battle to come for my friends. If I wasn't here, maybe it would play out as written. He nodded and pulled me into his arms, wrapping me in a crushing embrace. I squeezed him back with all my strength and laid my head on my chest. I do love you, I whispered into his chest. Please, don't die. He tilted my head up to look down into my eyes. I shall fight with all the strength within me. I shall fight to hear you say those words without fear in your voice, only joy. I reached up, pulling him down as I stretched onto my toes and carefully kissed him. His eyes slid closed, and I allowed my own to follow suit as I savored the softness and warmth of his lips moving against mine. I dropped back onto my heels, ending our kiss. It had been soft, chaste even, but a fire bloomed throughout me, chasing away any of my leftover aches and pains and easing the remaining ache in my heart. I smiled as I stepped back from him. I like that you aren't easy, I told him. I like that you demand more, that you want more. It may not be there yet, but I'll get there. I'll get there. Just don't die again. I expect you to live through this as well, he returned intensely, and then turned and walked away, Aragorn and Gimli trailing after him. Gimli turned back one last time. Watch him, I whispered, and thank you. His ears heard me, even at the distance. His eyes softened as he nodded. Then he, too, turned and was gone. I leaned against the building up stone fortifications of the parapet. Rourke's soldiers stretched out along the other side of me, along the parapet, bows at the ready as they nervously waited. I had removed my cloak and hidden my pack in preparation for the upcoming battle. Wanting nothing to slow me down or hinder me, in exchange for them, I had taken out my helmet, struggling to get used to its weight and the limit to my peripheral vision. Commotion built as pained screams and warriors' cries rang out. I could hear the garbled language of the orcs as they screamed and the pained cries of men as they retreated from the dike and through the gates of the deep. An old gray-haired soldier hobbled as quickly as he could to pass behind us along the parapet. I stepped back towards him. "What's going on?" He looked startled at my presence, no doubt startled by my gender, but then glanced over the parapet and shrugged. "The armies of the White Towers have come and driven back the men of the Westfold, still holding the dike. Archers are to hold their fire until the orcs are within range. We cannot waste even a single arrow," he explained in a gruff and accented voice. The old man turned and continued his running hobble, so I stepped back to the low wall, leaning to look around the taller upright. As I watched, I saw the glittering of spearheads shimmering in the darkness. It gave the illusion of a morbid rippling pond, but ever moving and coming closer. The soldiers to my right began repeating something over and over in Warwick. The litany caught my voice, and I realized from the high cracking pitch of the prayer that he was just a boy, shorter and smaller. Even then, I was at 5'8". I placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, smiling when he jumped at the contact. "It's all right to be frightened," I told him, hoping he understood Western. He jerked and looked into my face at my words. "You are a woman," he gasped in a thick accent. "Yep, but I'm here now, fighting with you and your brave people." The boy looked away. "I am not brave. I am frightened. Like I said, it's all right to be afraid." He looked up and down the line at the other soldiers. "They are not afraid. You are a woman, and you are not afraid. You stand here along with them, waiting for the battle to come. I want very much to run and hide again in my mother's skirts along with my younger sisters," he said, shame coloring his cheeks. "Fear is good, and I can guarantee you that every soldier here is afraid, me included. I've been a soldier for my people for many years, and I was always afraid, and I'm afraid now." I turned him bodily, forcing him to look into my eyes. "Fear is good. It means you've got something to lose. It means you've got something to fight for, and I've never been more afraid in battle than I am right now." "You stay even though you fear?" he whispered. "Yes. I stay because I have hope. Hope for the future, and hope for your people. Hope that boys like you will see the morning light of men." The angry shouts of the orcs came closer, the sounds of the human dunderlings with them now becoming apparent. The soldiers around us strung their bows, waiting for the enemy to come closer. I held the boy's soldiers, not yet turning to face battle. "What's your name?" He pressed a fist to his chest and bowed slightly at his waist. I am named Garwin, son of Garulf." I released his soldiers, returning the gesture. "I am Lane, and I am honored to fight beside you, Garwin." Together we turned and faced the oncoming tide, drawing arrows. I knocked my arrow, but realized Garwin beside me hadn't. I relaxed my arms and glanced at him. "I am not a strong archer, and Gamelin said we are not to waste a single arrow," he quietly admitted. Before I could answer, several arrows struck the parapet around us. I heard low thwacks of soldiers releasing arrows on either side of me. I glanced up as arrows struck the wall too high above us and fell to the stone floor of the parapet. I pulled my arrow back again and released it, aiming for the weakness in the armor of the orcs at the base of their neck. Silently, I gave thanks as it flew straight and true. Aiming a bow wasn't the same as aiming a sniper rifle, but I had learned to accommodate for the differences, and I'd certainly fire both a rifle and now a bow for longer than Garwin had. Knocking another bow, I threw over my shoulders. "Set your quiver beside me, Garwin, and gather the discarded arrows that those orcs fire." He nodded eagerly and ran to start gathering arrows as I continued firing. Soon the battle became heated, and I couldn't stop to watch Garwin, but I heard his startled gasps as arrows landed near him. "Keep your head down, Garwin," I shouted at him, now reaching into his quiver as I had fired my last arrow. Hours later, my body was still vibrating with the thrum and excitement of battle. "What are they doing?" Garwin asked, leaning over the edge of the parapet. I paused, leaning to look over too. "Get back!" I yelled, grabbing Garwin's shoulders and yanking him away as a grappling hook was launched over the edge and struck the wall of the deep behind us. I swung my bow over my back and grabbed my knife in my belt, pushing it at Garwin. I gestured for him to take his knife out as well. "Cut the ropes," I ordered, pointing to the other grappling hooks being thrown over the parapets. Garwin and I passed each other many times, running along the wall, cutting the ropes of grappling hooks as swiftly as we could. But then Garwin's pained cry caught my attention. I turned to see him holding his bleeding forearm as he struggled to regain his feet. I quickly sliced through the thick rope of the grappling hook that had struck him, knocking him down and just beginning to pull tight against him and trapping him against the outer wall of the battlement. But as I knelt over him, trying to help the boy to his feet, another heavy grappling hook was launched over the edge near us, glancing off my helmet and the echo of it ringing in my ears. "Damn it," I growled, pulling Garwin and myself further behind a taller portion of the parapets. I looked around us, up and down the line of the wall. The bodies of fallen Rourke soldiers littered the walkway, most pierced by orc arrows, some stuck as Garwin had been caught by the grappling hooks. "There are too many of them," I told Garwin as I watched more and more hooks sail over the edge. "And not enough of us," I whispered to myself. "We've got to pull back," I told him in a louder voice. He nodded and I stood, pulling him up behind me and keeping a hand on his shoulder as I pulled him along behind me. At the top of the stairs leading to the ground near the gate, I paused, taking in the sight of the splintered wood and orcs beginning to push through. Unsheathing my sword, I turned to Garwin. "How are you with the sword?" He smiled grimly, the harsh horrors of the battle aging him already. "I am best with spear," he admitted, "but my father taught me well to use a sword." I nodded. "Stay close behind me. We've got to make it down these stairs and past those orcs to safer ground." I didn't wait for his response, merely gripping my sword tighter and sprinting down the open staircase. Several orcs turned and started up the staircase toward me, several more waiting at the base. I had the advantage of the height, but maneuvering would be difficult on stairs. As Legolas had pointed out, my sword work was rudimentary at best, where I excelled at being able to outmaneuver someone with the use of swordsmanship and martial arts combined. Without the slowing of my steps or my thought, I launched over the side of the open staircase, bypassing the orcs and the last 15 feet of the staircase. I landed on the ground, absorbing the hit with my legs, allowing them to bend as I dropped my shoulder and rolled, slowing enough to pop out of the roll into my feet again. Miraculously, I had kept my sword, and I ran at the startled orcs, cutting through them as they watched me in shock. I met Garwin at the bottom of the staircase, grinning as he dispatched the last several orcs that had been advancing upwards between us. He grinned as he met my gaze. "That was reckless," he called over the din of clashing swords and armor. I threw my head back and laughed. "Yeah, I guess it was." "Come on," I told him, gesturing back towards the keep. More orcs stood between us, but Garwin and I began cutting through them, pushing forward, foot by foot. "Lane!" I hacked through the orc in front of me, my arms growing tired and my movement sluggish and choppy, but looked up at the gruff voice I recognized calling my name. Gimli stood in the small opening of a rock wall 15 or 20 feet away, gesturing frantically with his hands for me to come to him. "Garwin, you still with me?" I yelled out, looking for the young man. "I am here, Lane," he called to my left, his voice sounding as tired as I did, but still managing to cut through the onslaught of orcs with more grace than I managed. I spun and blocked the swords of an orc as I jerked my head towards Gimli. "Come on, we've got to make for the safety of the caves." He nodded and pushed closer to me, joining me as together we pushed towards the dwarfs. Gimli and several Rourke soldiers, including the old man I'd spoken to on the parrot, pushed out from the narrow opening, fighting back the orcs and creating an opening for Garwin and I to run through. Safely inside the narrow passage of the dark cave, I finally allowed myself to double over, bracing my hands on my knees as I lowered my head and tried to catch my breath. Gimli joined me, leaving two of the Roran guards to the narrow entrance of the cave. "I'm glad to see you alive and well, lass," he boomed, clapping me on the back. I winced at his echoing voice and heavy hand, but then grinned at the reminder. I was alive. Hurt just meant that I was still alive. "Yeah, I'm alive," I whispered to him. The old man stopped in front of me as I strained to lean back against the jagged rock. "Never was I more shocked than in the moment when I saw you cutting your way through the hordes of Isengard." "A woman," the old man marveled. "Never did I think a woman would last but mere moments in the heat of battle." I grinned and held out my hand, and never have I been more shocked to see an old man bent and grizzled with age last but mere moments in the heat of battle. For a moment he stared in shock at me, but no doubt shocked by my audacity, but then chuckled and grasped my outstretched forearm, gripping it tightly with his free hand as well. "You have the form of a woman, but the mouth of a soldier," he laughed. I grinned, glad that he hadn't taken offense. He shook my arm once and then released it. "I am Gamling." I nodded respectfully. "I'm Lane, and I've got the mouth of a soldier in more ways than one. I'd kill for a bear, or ale, or hell, even some mead." He chuckled again and lightly grabbed my shoulder, pulling me further into the depths of the cave, where torches intermittently lit the dark interior. "You never said there was drink," Gimli groused, following along. "A drop of well would do wonders for this dwarf after such axe work." I grabbed Gawain as we passed. "Come, you've more than earned a drink as well." Gameling handed me leather skin with liquid, and for once I was thankful for the protocol that said ladies drank first. I sighed appreciatively at this surprising cool ale that washed down my dry throat, and then passed it along to Gimli. Glancing again at the dwarf, I asked, "How was Legolas?" He glanced away. "He was fine, last I saw, but we were separated." I nodded. "He'll be fine. Come morning you'll see. He'll be fine," I assured us both. As the others drank, I looked around the interior of the cave at the soldiers gathering here. Most stayed near the front, sitting along the wall of the caves, their face drawn and taut. I felt my spirit darken as their feelings of futileness encroached on my subconscious. In the heat of battle, my adrenaline allowed me to easily push their minds away. But now that the adrenaline was subsiding, it took real effort to keep their thoughts out again. Not for the first time, I wished their minds were soft and gentle like elvish minds. I looked up to see the gaze of Eramor watching me from near the opening of the cave. I'd missed him when we'd enter. Walking closer, I stopped to lean against the wall across from him, only a few feet separating. "I must admit," he told me, "I too was surprised to see you pushing through that sea of creatures. I would not have thought of a woman to stand when so many have fallen." I heard the sadness for his people in his words, and glanced again at the entrance, but I couldn't see past the two men guarding it. He looked that direction as well as he continued speaking. "It matters not. We can only hold this cave for so long before they push through even so narrow an opening." "All isn't lost," I told him. "I wouldn't feel things were so futile if I were you. It's a narrow opening, and we only have to hold it long enough." He looked at me curiously, but I turned back to Gawain, who had followed to stand beside me. I noticed his need to remain close. We'd fought side by side for hours. A closeness forms in that camaraderie and those shared horrors that no words can accurately fit. The cut on his forearm was mostly dried with blood, but some still dripped lazily down his arm and fingertips. "Gamling," I called, turning to the old man, "do you have bandages and perhaps something to stitch a wound in this cave?" He nodded. "I saw to the supplies in these caves myself," he exclaimed, carefully examining Gawain's wound before he hobbled off. He came back with an armful of bandages and even a bowl of water. "The wound can be cleaned and wrapped, but stitches will have to wait for healers if we yet live through the night," he exclaimed. I looked through the cloth bundle and saw that he had indeed brought needle and thread for the wound, despite his words. "That's okay. I can stitch a wound just fine," I told him, dipping a cloth in the water and gently wiping Gawain's arm. Like the men Like the man he had become sometime during the night, Garwin bit his lip and stoically bared the pain as I closed the wound. Wrapping it tightly with cloth afterward, I squeezed his shoulder and proudly told him, "You are a fine man, Garwin. Your father will be proud." He looked down as a blush colored his cheeks. "My father fell defending the Westfold from the Dunderlings," he admitted. "Won't stop him from being proud," I replied. He looked up at my words, confidence infusing him as his shoulders rolled back. "You're the man of your family now in every way," I said, forcing a smile, and hoping he didn't see the sadness I felt at that. It couldn't be changed, and he deserved to feel proud. As the ambient light began to increase in the cave, I knew the sky outside must be turning to gray with the dawn. I bumped Garwin with my shoulder from where we sat, and then stood. "Come on," I told him, as he struggled tiredly to his feet. "You'll loosen up once the fighting starts again. Get ready," I told him, rolling my head and shoulders as I stretched. Gimli stood on my other side, copied my motions, and drawing his axe. "What will we find with the dawn, lass?" he whispered to me. I smiled down at him. "Dawn always brings hope, Gimli. Never forget that. There's always hope." As I spoke, the great horn sounded through the deep. It echoes ringing even within the ground of our cave, rattling the rocks. The guard at the entrance of the cave gave excited shouts, and Oromir sounded the order for attack as we pushed out into the brilliant light of dawn. I shielded my eyes with my sword arm, the orange and pink rays of dawn, bright and blinding after a stay in the dim light of the cave. But the swords of orcs soon slashed in my direction, forcing me to turn and dance out of their reach as I brought my arm down, swinging my sword to meet theirs as the macabre dance began again. But hope now filling the air, for the first time since the battle began last night. Victorious shouts and battle cries filled the air. The Roran attacked, taking up the call once again, and all their hope for not only surviving, but winning the battle surged. On foot, I pushed along with all the Roran around me as we forced the remaining orcs and Dunderlings from the deep and back towards the walls and gates. As we pushed outward, new riders led by Gandalf and Erkenbrand pushed inwards, cutting through the last of the enemy. "We have won!" Garwin shouted beside me. "Erkenbrand and Gandalf came, he said in surprise. I laughed and threw my arm around his shoulders, basking in the sight of the cheering roar and the conquering riders who had come in our hour of need. "Yeah, we won," I whispered to him. Suddenly, strong arms pulled me away from Garwin and engulfed me in a crushing embrace. Even if I hadn't guessed whose arms were wrapped around me, the faint, sweet musk of the chest against my nose, and the gentle thoughts now flowing over my mind would have given him away. "Legolas," I whispered, my voice feeling almost weak with contentment. "You are alive," he whispered against my ear. I pulled back as he brushed the many stray and frizzy hairs sticking to my sweaty and grimy cheeks away, slicking them behind my ears. I was almost shocked he could stand to touch me, but as I looked at the sheen of sweat and spatters of dark blood clothing his own cheeks, I realized it didn't matter. I wiped the streaks of black blood away from his cheek and stretched onto my toes again to lightly kiss his cheek. "You're alive," I whispered in return to him, a piece of my heart settling back into place. I hadn't realized until this moment, with him again in my arms, how scared I had been that my presence would once more mess things up, that he'd die this time and not come back. His eyes had closed at my kiss, but they opened again as I dropped back to my heels. "Yes," he answered simply, pressing a longer kiss to my forehead. When he pulled away, I looked up to see him looking Garwin over curiously. The poor young man was rooted in place, shock and awe written clearly in his expression at the sight of the elf. I stepped closer to him, clasping him on the shoulder as I introduced him to Legolas. "This is Legolas, an elf from the woodland realm," I said, remembering that Legolas did not flaunt nor ever even really seem to care for his father royalty. "And this is Garwin," I continued, "who fought long and hard by my side all through the night." Legolas stepped closer and bowed his head respectfully to Garwin as he wrapped an arm around my waist. "My thanks, dear boy, for fighting alongside my lady," he told Garwin. I almost laughed at him calling me his lady, but ignored it and looked at Garwin objectively, trying to see with his new eyes as Legolas no doubt saw him, as I'd seen him last night. I realized that for all the transformation I saw spring forth in him now, to the eye, Garwin still looked like a boy, maybe no more than 13 or 14 years old. Wrapping my own arm around Legolas's waist, I gripped his opposite hip tightly in return. Garwin is a man, Legolas. He began the night as a boy, but with the new light he has become a man, I spoke softly, turning to look up into Legolas's eyes. Garwin stood taller and proudly rolled back his shoulders at my words, but Legolas and I held our shared gaze, sharing the moment of the mourning for the death of the boy that Garwin had been just last night.